I can still taste the chlorine in the air and feel the desert heat bouncing off the concrete when my father-in-law said those words that would echo in my mind for months. It was Bob's annual summer barbecue, the kind where he fires up his expensive grill and makes sure everyone knows exactly how much he spent on the steaks. The whole Martinez family was scattered around his pristine Scottsdale backyard, ice-cold Coronas sweating in the 100-degree heat, kids splashing in the pool while the adults gathered under the ramada he'd built with his own hands. As he reminded us every single year, Bob was holding court as usual, talking about success and making something of yourself in America. His chest was puffed out in that way it gets when he's about to make a point that he thinks will settle an argument nobody was having. That's when David walked over. My quiet 17-year-old son, still dripping from the pool, towel around his shoulders, trying to grab a burger from the table. And Bob, my husband's father, the man who never let anyone forget he built a successful contracting business from nothing, looked at David and shook his head with that patronizing smile that made my stomach clench. "Still planning on wasting your brain up in Flagstaff playing with trees?" Bob said, loud enough for the entire family to hear. "When you could be making real money at a real school?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun was brutal that day, but nothing compared to the heat I felt rising in my chest as I watched my son's face change. David didn't flinch, didn't argue back, just nodded politely and said, "Yes, sir," the way I'd taught him to respond to elders, even when they were being cruel. But I saw it, that tiny flicker in his eyes, the same look he got when kids at school made jokes about him spending lunch period in the environmental club instead of playing basketball or chasing girls. My name is Sarah Martinez, and I've been watching my son get underestimated his entire life. Not because he wasn't brilliant. David had a 4.2 GPA and could explain the entire ecosystem of the Sonoran Desert better than most college professors. Not because he wasn't driven. He'd been volunteering at the Desert Botanical Garden since he was 14 and spent his weekends hiking every trail in the Phoenix Mountain Preserve, collecting samples and taking notes in the leather journal I'd given him for his 15th birthday. The problem was that his brilliance didn't fit into the neat little boxes that the Martinez family had decided were acceptable. Bob Martinez came to Arizona from Sonora 53 years ago with $27 and a toolbox, and he'd built Martinez Construction into one of the most successful companies in the valley. He was proud of that, rightfully so, but somewhere along the way, he'd decided that success only came in 3 flavors: business, medicine, or law. Everything else was just expensive hobbies that parents indulged in their children before they grew up and got serious about life. My sister-in-law Linda was already nodding along with Bob's assessment, probably because her daughter Jessica had just finished her sophomore year at Stanford studying business administration. Jessica was the golden child, the one whose achievements got framed and hung on Bob's office wall, the one whose internship at a Silicon Valley startup got mentioned at every family gathering like it was breaking news. Don't get me wrong, Jessica worked hard and deserved recognition, but the way the family talked about her made it sound like she'd personally invented capitalism. "David's smart enough for ASU's business program," Linda chimed in, adjusting her eye sunglasses and taking a sip of her margarita. "Or he could do pre-med at University of Arizona like his cousin Miguel. Make some real money, help people, make the family proud." The family proud. As if David's choice to study environmental science at Northern Arizona University was somehow a personal insult to the Martinez legacy. As if wanting to protect the forests and rivers and wildlife that made Arizona beautiful was less noble than selling office buildings or prescribing antibiotics. I wanted to jump in, to defend my son, to remind them that David had turned down early admission to 3 different universities because he'd fallen in love with NAU's forestry program during a campus visit. I wanted to tell them about the research project he'd been working on about water conservation in desert climates, or how his environmental science teacher had told me that David asked questions that made her reconsider things she'd been teaching for 15 years. But I knew better. In the Martinez family, defending your position was seen as weakness, as proof that you weren't confident in your choices. My husband, Carlos, was grilling corn on the cob, staying strategically busy so he wouldn't have to take sides between his family and his son. Carlos loved David fiercely, but he'd learned long ago that going against his father in public was a battle that left everyone bloody and nothing resolved. He caught my eye over the smoke from the grill and gave me that look that said, "Let it go, we'll talk about it later." But David, my beautiful, thoughtful son, wasn't letting it go. Not this time. "Actually, Grandpa Bob," David said, his voice steady despite the fact that every adult eye in the backyard was now focused on him. "I think environmental science is pretty real, especially with climate change and water shortages. Arizona's going to need people who understand how to protect natural resources." The silence that followed was the kind that makes you aware of every sound around you. The pool filter humming, a neighbor's lawnmower in the distance, the sizzle of meat on the grill. Bob's face went through a series of expressions, starting with surprise that David had actually responded, moving through irritation, and landing on that condescending amusement that adults use when children say something they think is cute but wrong. "Climate change," Bob repeated, shaking his head. "Son, I've been building in this desert for 30 years. The climate's always been hot. What you need to worry about is building something that lasts, making money that'll support a family someday. You can't pay a mortgage with good intentions and tree samples." Uncle Mike laughed, the kind of laugh that's meant to signal that the conversation is over and everyone should move on to safer topics. But I could see David's jaw tighten, could see him choosing his words carefully, the way he did when he was about to make a point that mattered to him. The Bureau of Land. Management starts their environmental scientists at $68,000 a year, David said quietly. Forest Service research positions start at $75,000. That's not counting federal benefits or advancement opportunities. I felt a surge of pride. My son had done his research, knew exactly what career path he was choosing and what it would mean financially. But before I could say anything supportive, Linda was already shaking her head. "That's government work, honey," she said in that voice adults use when they're about to explain something they think you're too young to understand. "Government jobs don't have the same growth potential as private sector. Jessica's internship alone is going to lead to connections that could make her 6 figures before she's 25. And there it was, the comparison that followed David everywhere. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica, the business major, Jessica, the networker, Jessica, the one who understood how the real world worked. Never mind that David could identify every plant native to the Sonoran Desert, or that he'd been published in his high school's environmental research journal. Never mind that he'd spent his junior year developing a water filtration system using native plants that had caught the attention of environmental groups across the state. Different paths for different people, I said finally, unable to stay quiet any longer. David's found something he's passionate about, something he's genuinely gifted at. Bob turned his attention to me then, and I could see in his eyes the same dismissiveness he'd just shown David. In Bob's world, I was just another person who didn't understand how success really worked. Carlos's wife, the elementary school teacher, who dealt with children all day and didn't grasp the complexities of building wealth and status in the adult world. "Sarah, you're a good mother," Bob said, and somehow he made it sound like an insult. But part of being a good parent is helping your kids make smart choices, not just supporting whatever feels good in the moment. David's a bright boy, but he's 17. He doesn't understand what it means to struggle financially, to worry about providing for a family. You and Carlos have protected him from that reality. The implication hung in the desert air like heat shimmer. That I was naive, that I was doing David a disservice by encouraging his environmental science dreams instead of pushing him toward something more practical, more lucrative, more acceptable to the Martinez family's definition of success. I glanced at David, expecting to see hurt or frustration, but instead, I saw something else. Determination. The same look he got when he was working on a particularly challenging research project, or when he was trying to photograph a rare bird that kept hiding in the mesquite. It was the look of someone who had just decided something important. "I appreciate everyone's concern," David said, his voice calm and respectful, but with an undertone of steel that I recognized from myself when I'd finally had enough of someone's nonsense. "But I'm comfortable with my choice. NAU has an excellent program, and I'm excited about the opportunities there." Bob chuckled, the kind of chuckle that said he found David's confidence both amusing and misguided. "Well, I hope you're still excited when you're 30 and trying to make ends meet on a government salary while Jessica's buying her second house." That was the moment. Not just the words themselves, but the way Bob said them. Like David's future happiness and success were already predetermined failures. Like my son's dreams were nothing more than expensive mistakes that the family would eventually have to fix. I saw David's hands clench slightly around his towel, saw him take a deep breath the way I'd taught him to do when he was little, and felt overwhelmed by big emotions. But he didn't explode, didn't storm off, didn't give Bob the dramatic reaction that would have confirmed every adult's suspicion that he was too immature to make his own decisions. Instead, David smiled. Not a happy smile, but the kind of smile that says you've learned something important about someone, something you won't forget. "We'll see, Grandpa Bob," David said simply. "We'll see." The conversation moved on after that, shifting to safer topics like the Diamondbacks' chances this season and whether the monsoon rains would come early this year. But something had changed in that backyard. Something that wouldn't become clear until months later when David walked across the graduation stage at Desert Ridge High School. That night, after we'd helped clean up and said our goodbyes and driven home through the desert darkness, David was unusually quiet. Not upset quiet, but thoughtful quiet. The kind of silence that meant he was processing something important. I wanted to say something supportive, to tell him that Bob was wrong, that his choices were valid and his dreams were worth pursuing. But I'd learned over the years that David processed things differently than I did. That sometimes the best thing I could do was give him space to think. It wasn't until we were pulling into our driveway in Mesa that David finally spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice soft but certain, "I'm going to prove him wrong." I turned off the engine and looked at my son in the dim light from our porch lamp. At 17, David was tall and lean like his father, but he had my stubborn streak and my tendency to dig in when someone told him he couldn't do something. In that moment, I saw something in his face that I'd never seen before. Not just determination, but purpose. Like he'd finally found his North Star. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," I told him, "because that's what mothers are supposed to say. You just have to be true to yourself." David nodded, but I could see that he wasn't really listening to my maternal wisdom. He was already somewhere else, already planning something that I wouldn't fully understand until graduation day. "I know, Mom," he said, gathering his pool bag and towel. "But sometimes proving people wrong is the same thing as being true to yourself." As we walked to the front door, I had no idea that my son had just made a decision that would change everything. I didn't know that he was about to embark on the most focused, determined 4 months of his high school career. I didn't know that he was already planning something that would make Bob's words come back to haunt him in the most spectacular way possible. All I knew was that something had shifted in my quiet, thoughtful son, and that the David who walked into our house that night was different from the one who had left that morning. He had the look of someone who had just accepted a challenge, someone who was ready to prove that dreams and practicality weren't mutually exclusive, that passion and success could exist in the same space. What I didn't know was that David had been working on something in secret, something that would make Bob's predictions about government salaries and financial struggles sound not just wrong, but embarrassingly uninformed. Something that would turn a family barbecue conversation into the motivation for one of the most satisfying moments of my life as a mother. But that night, all I knew was that my son had decided to fight back, not with anger or arguments, but with something much more powerful. He was going to fight back with proof. The weeks following that barbecue felt different in our house, like the air pressure had changed before a storm. David went about his usual routine, waking up early for his morning runs through the desert trails behind our neighborhood, helping me prepare breakfast, heading off to Desert Ridge High with his worn backpack full of textbooks and that leather journal he carried everywhere. But there was an intensity to his movements now, a focus that hadn't been there before. I first noticed it in the way he approached his homework. David had always been a diligent student, but now he attacked his assignments with surgical precision, staying up until midnight perfecting essays that were already better than anything his classmates would submit. When I'd peek into his room around 11, I'd find him surrounded by research materials, his laptop screen glowing with multiple tabs open to scientific journals and environmental studies that looked far too advanced for high school coursework. "What are you working on so late?" I asked one Thursday evening, setting a cup of chamomile tea on his desk next to a stack of printed articles about watershed management and desert ecosystem preservation. David looked up from his notebook, where he'd been taking notes in his careful, precise handwriting. His dark eyes had that distant look they got when he was deep in research mode, like he was seeing connections and patterns that existed beyond the immediate assignment. "Just a paper for AP Environmental Science," he said, which was technically true, but didn't explain why he had 17 browser tabs open to peer-reviewed research from universities across the country. "Mrs. Rodriguez said we could write about any environmental issue affecting Arizona. I'm focusing on water resource management in arid climates." I picked up one of the printed articles, squinting at the dense academic language and complex charts showing precipitation patterns and aquifer depletion rates across the Southwest. This wasn't typical high school research material. This was graduate-level work, the kind of thing that environmental science doctoral students struggled with. "This looks pretty advanced, mijo," I said, using the nickname I'd called him since he was small. "Are you sure you're not taking on too much?" David smiled, but it wasn't his usual easy grin. This smile had an edge to it, like he knew something the rest of us hadn't figured out yet. "I want to make sure I really understand what I'm getting into," he said, gesturing toward the acceptance letter from Northern Arizona University that he'd pinned to his bulletin board back in March. "If I'm going to study environmental science, I want to know what I'm talking about when people ask me about career prospects." The way he said career prospects made my chest tighten. I could hear Bob's voice in those words, could see the shadow of that barbecue conversation in David's determination to prove himself before he'd even started college. Part of me wanted to tell him that he didn't need to justify his choices to anyone, that his passion for environmental protection was valuable regardless of what his grandfather thought. But I also recognized the steel in my son's voice, the same stubborn determination that had gotten me through teaching credential programs and single parenting challenges that had seemed impossible at the time. "Just don't burn yourself out," I said, kissing the top of his head. "You've already gotten into your dream school. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." But even as I said the words, I knew David wasn't listening. He'd already turned back to his research, his pen moving across the notebook page as he synthesized information from multiple sources into something that would probably make his environmental science teacher question whether she was adequately challenging her students. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter written in David's neat handwriting. "Gone for early morning hike at South Mountain. Back by 8 for breakfast." It was 5:30 in the morning, still dark outside, and my 17-year-old son was already out in the desert with his field notebook and camera, documenting plant species and water usage patterns like he was conducting an official scientific survey. This became his new routine: morning hikes before school, lunch periods spent in the environmental science classroom working on independent research projects, afternoons at the Desert Botanical Garden, where he'd somehow convinced the staff to let him assist with their native plant propagation programs. Weekends that used to be filled with hanging out with friends or playing video games were now dedicated to what David called field work, which seemed to involve a lot of hiking, note-taking, and photography of desert landscapes that looked identical to my untrained eye but apparently contained crucial data about soil composition and plant adaptation. Carlos noticed the change too. One Saturday morning, he found David in the garage at 6 a.m., organizing field equipment like he was preparing for a scientific expedition rather than a casual desert hike. "You planning to climb Everest?" Carlos asked, watching David methodically pack water bottles, sample containers, measuring tools, and what looked like professional-grade pH testing strips into his hiking backpack. David looked up from his checklist, completely serious. "Just want to be thorough in my data collection. I'm documenting microclimates in different elevation zones of the Phoenix Mountains. The variations in plant communities could be significant for understanding adaptation strategies in arid environments." Carlos stared at his son for a long moment, probably trying to decide whether to be impressed or concerned that his teenager was talking like a research scientist. Finally, he just shook his head and smiled. "Just be careful out there, mijo, and text us when you reach the trailhead." But David's transformation wasn't limited to his academic pursuits. I started noticing changes in how he interacted with the family during our regular Sunday dinners at my mother-in-law Rosa's house in Central Phoenix. Where David used to sit quietly during the adults' conversations about work and politics and neighborhood gossip, now he actively participated, especially when the conversation touched on anything related to Arizona's environment or economy. 2 weeks after the barbecue incident, Uncle Mike was complaining about new water restrictions that the city had implemented during the summer months. He was grumbling about having to limit his lawn watering and how the regulations were hurting property values in his neighborhood. "It's government overreach," Mike said, cutting into the carne asada that Rosa had spent all afternoon preparing. "We live in a desert, but that doesn't mean we can't have nice yards. People work hard for their homes. They should be able to water their grass." In the past, David would have continued eating in silence, maybe catching my eye with a look that said he disagreed but wasn't going to start an argument with his uncle. But this time, he set down his fork and spoke up. "Actually, Uncle Mike, Phoenix uses about 40% more water per capita than other major cities," David said conversationally, like he was discussing the weather rather than challenging a family elder. "Most of that excess usage comes from landscape irrigation for non-native plants that aren't adapted to desert conditions. The restrictions aren't government overreach. They're necessary for long-term water security." The table went quiet. Rosa paused in the middle of serving more, rice, her wooden spoon hovering over the pot. Carlos looked like he was preparing to intervene if the conversation got heated. Mike's face went through several expressions before settling on bewildered irritation. "Where are you getting these statistics?" Mike asked, his voice carrying that edge adults get when teenagers say things that sound too informed to dismiss easily. David reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like bookmarked articles and research papers. Arizona Department of Water Resources publishes annual usage reports. The data shows that residential landscape irrigation accounts for 62% of municipal water usage in Phoenix, compared to 38% in cities like Denver or Portland, where people use native landscaping. He looked up from his phone, meeting Mike's eyes with quiet confidence. "The restrictions aren't about government control. They're about making sure we have enough water for essential needs 20 years from now. Climate models show that the Colorado River, which supplies 60% of Phoenix's water, is going to have significantly reduced flow due to prolonged drought conditions." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when everyone, At the table realizes that the quiet teenager they've been half ignoring has just demonstrated a level of knowledge that makes the adults feel underprepared for the conversation. Rosa broke the tension by asking David if he wanted more beans, but I could see the wheels turning in everyone's heads. This wasn't the same David who used to nod politely and avoid controversial topics. This was someone who had clearly been doing serious research and wasn't afraid to share what he'd learned, even when it contradicted his elders' opinions. After dinner, as we were loading the dishwasher, Rosa pulled me aside in her kitchen. At 73, my mother-in-law had the kind of wisdom that comes from raising 5 children and managing a household through decades of economic ups and downs. She'd always been fond of David, appreciating his quiet manners and genuine interest in her stories about growing up in Sonora. But tonight, I could see something new in her expression. "That boy of yours," she said in Spanish, scraping leftover rice into a container for David to take home. "He's different lately. More serious. More focused." I nodded, not sure how to explain the change I'd been witnessing. He's always been interested in environmental issues, but lately it's like he's preparing for something specific. Rosa smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she understood things about family dynamics that the rest of us were still figuring out. Sometimes young people need to prove themselves, especially when the old people don't see their value right away. The way she said it made me think she'd noticed more than just David's newfound confidence in family discussions. Rosa had been at Bob's barbecue too, had witnessed the exchange about David's college choice and career prospects. She'd probably seen the same thing I'd seen in David's face that day. The moment when my son decided that quiet acceptance wasn't going to be his strategy anymore. "He's working very hard," I said, which was an understatement. David's dedication to his environmental research had become almost obsessive, like he was trying to compress 4 years of college-level learning into his final months of high school. "Good," Rosa said firmly. "Smart boys shouldn't have to hide how smart they are just to make other people comfortable." That night, driving home through the desert darkness with David in the passenger seat, I found myself thinking about Rosa's words. My son had spent years moderating his intelligence, dumbing down his interests to avoid standing out too much in a family that valued conformity and traditional success markers. But something had shifted that day at Bob's barbecue, something that was pushing David to stop hiding his capabilities and start demonstrating them. "You've been working really hard lately," I said as we waited at a red light near our neighborhood. "Are you feeling pressure about starting college in the fall?" David was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the saguaro cacti silhouetted against the star-filled sky. When he finally spoke, his voice had that thoughtful quality it got when he was trying to articulate something important. "I've been thinking about what Grandpa Bob said," he admitted, "about wasting my brain, about not understanding financial reality, and I realized he's right about one thing." My stomach clenched. The last thing I wanted was for David to start doubting his choices because of Bob's narrow-minded comments. "What do you mean?" David turned to look at me, and in the dim light, from the dashboard, I could see that familiar, determined expression. "He's right that I need to understand the financial and career implications of my choices, but he's wrong about what those implications are. Environmental science isn't a dead-end field for tree huggers who don't understand economics. It's one of the fastest-growing sectors in the job market, especially in states like Arizona, where water management and sustainable development are becoming critical issues." I felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. My son was developing the kind of confidence that comes from deep research and genuine expertise, but I worried about the pressure he was putting on himself to justify his dreams to people who might never understand or appreciate them. "You don't have to prove anything to your grandfather," I said gently. "Your value isn't determined by other people's opinions." David smiled, but it was that new smile again, the one that suggested he was working on something bigger than just proving a point to one dismissive relative. "I know, Mom, but sometimes proving people wrong is just a side effect of proving yourself right." As we pulled into our driveway, I realized that my son was no longer the quiet teenager who absorbed family criticism without response. He was becoming someone who understood his own worth and wasn't afraid to demonstrate it. The David who had been dismissed at Bob's barbecue was transforming into someone who would be impossible to dismiss, someone who would command respect through the sheer force of his knowledge and dedication. What I didn't know yet was that David's research and preparation weren't just about personal confidence or family dynamics. He was working towards something specific, something that would make Bob's predictions about government salaries and limited opportunities sound not just wrong, but spectacularly uninformed. My son was preparing for a moment that would change how our entire family understood success, opportunity, and the value of following your passion. But that night, all I knew was that David had found his focus, and that focus was transforming him into someone who would never again accept being underestimated without consequences. The summer before David's senior year passed in a blur of research, fieldwork, and what seemed like preparation for something far more significant than just starting college in the fall. While his classmates were working summer jobs at restaurants and retail stores, David had somehow secured an unpaid internship with the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, spending his days in laboratories and field sites, learning about water quality testing and soil contamination assessment. I found out about the internship by accident when I picked him up early one afternoon and found him emerging from a government building downtown, wearing safety goggles and carrying a clipboard full of data sheets that looked like they belonged in a graduate research program. "When did you arrange this?" I asked as David buckled his seatbelt, his clothes still smelling faintly of the chemicals used in environmental testing labs. "I applied back in April," he said casually, as if landing competitive internships with state environmental agencies was something high school students did every summer. Dr. Martinez, the director of the Water Quality Division, said they don't usually accept high school interns, but my application essay impressed her. Of course it did. By April, David had been conducting his own independent research for months, compiling data and analysis that probably rivaled the work of college juniors. The fact that he'd managed to convince state environmental professionals to take him seriously was impressive, but not particularly surprising given the level of expertise he'd been developing. "What kind of work are you doing there?" I asked, genuinely curious about what my 17-year-old son was contributing to state environmental protection efforts. David's eyes lit up with enthusiasm, the way they always did when he talked about environmental science. "Right now, I'm helping with a study on heavy metal contamination in Phoenix area groundwater. We're testing samples from different well sites to track pollution sources and assess remediation needs." He pulled out his smartphone and showed me photographs of water samples in labeled containers, charts showing contamination levels, and maps marked with testing locations across the valley. This wasn't busy work designed to keep a teenager occupied for the summer. This was real scientific research that would influence policy decisions affecting millions of people. Dr. Martinez said my analysis of the correlation between industrial, site proximity, and contamination levels was graduate-level work, David continued, scrolling through more images of his research materials. She asked if I'd be interested in co-authoring a paper for the Journal of Environmental Science and Health. I almost swerved into the next lane. My high school son was being invited to co-author academic papers in professional scientific journals. This was the kind of opportunity that college seniors competed for, the kind of credential that opened doors to graduate programs and research careers. "David, that's incredible," I managed to say, still processing the implications of what he'd just told me. "Do you realize how unusual this is?" David shrugged, but I could see the pride in his expression. "Dr. Martinez says environmental science is all about practical application of research. The fact that I'm still in high school doesn't matter if the work is solid." That evening, I found myself staring at David's acceptance letter from Northern Arizona University, which had been pinned to his bulletin board for months. What had seemed like a reasonable choice for a smart kid interested in environmental issues now looked like the foundation for something much more significant. My son wasn't just planning to study environmental science, he was already practicing it at a professional level. The transformation in David's confidence was becoming impossible to ignore. At family gatherings, he no longer sat quietly while the adults discussed current events and economic issues. Instead, he contributed insights that came from genuine expertise, rather than just opinions. When Aunt Linda complained about new emissions standards affecting her husband's trucking business, David explained the health benefits of reduced air, pollution, and the economic advantages of cleaner transportation technology. When Uncle Mike grumbled about environmental regulations hurting job growth, David cited studies showing that the renewable energy sector was creating jobs faster than traditional energy industries. The family's response to David's newfound assertiveness was mixed. Rosa seemed delighted that her quiet grandson was finally showing his intelligence openly. Carlos was proud, but slightly worried about David challenging his elders so directly. Linda and Mike appeared uncomfortable with having their assumptions questioned by someone they still saw as a child, even when that child clearly knew more about the topics than they did. But it was Bob's reaction that interested me most. David's grandfather had always been the kind of man who respected expertise and hard work, even when he disagreed with someone's conclusions. As David's knowledge and confidence grew more apparent, I could see Bob reassessing his assumptions about his grandson's career choice. He didn't apologize for his comments at the barbecue, but he stopped making dismissive remarks about environmental science being impractical. The real test came in August, during Rosa's 74th birthday celebration. The entire extended family was gathered in her backyard. 3 generations of Martinez relatives sharing food and stories under the ramada that Carlos and his brothers had built the previous spring. The conversation had turned to water shortages and the ongoing drought affecting the Southwest, a topic that had become impossible to avoid as Lake Mead continued dropping to record low levels. "They're saying we might have to start rationing water for agriculture," said David's cousin Miguel, who was home from University of Arizona where he was studying pre-med. "That's going to hurt the economy if farmers can't irrigate their crops." "It's all overblown," Bob said, settling back in his lawn chair with a beer. "We've had droughts before. We'll have them again. The government always finds a way to keep the water flowing when it really matters." In the past, this would have been the end of the conversation. Bob's pronouncements on practical matters usually went unchallenged, especially by younger family members who were expected to defer to his experience and wisdom. But David looked up from his plate of carnitas and rice, and I could see that he was choosing his words carefully. "Actually, Grandpa Bob, this drought is different from historical patterns," David said respectfully but firmly. "The Colorado River has been in drought conditions for 23 years, and the trend is accelerating due to climate change and increased water demand from population growth." Bob's expression shifted from casual dismissal to genuine attention. David's tone wasn't argumentative or confrontational. It was the tone of someone sharing information that might be useful to the conversation. "Lake Mead is at 35% capacity, which is the lowest level since the reservoir was first filled in the 1930s, David continued, pulling out his phone to show charts and graphs that looked like they came from official government sources. "Arizona's water allocation from the Colorado River is going to be cut by 18% starting next year, and that's just the beginning. The Bureau of Reclamation projects that we could see 40% reductions within the next decade." The family had gone quiet, not with the uncomfortable silence that usually followed David's fact-based challenges to conventional wisdom, but with the kind of attention that people give to information that might actually affect their lives. "Where are you getting these numbers?" Bob asked, but his tone wasn't dismissive. He sounded genuinely curious about David's sources. "Bureau of Reclamation publishes monthly reports on Colorado River water levels," David replied, navigating to official government websites on his phone. "I've been tracking the data as part of my internship with the State Environmental Quality Department. The situation is more serious than most people realize because the media focuses on short-term weather patterns instead of long-term hydrological trends. Miguel leaned forward, suddenly interested in a conversation that had moved beyond casual family discussion into something that might be relevant to his own future. So, what does that mean for cities like Phoenix? Are we going to run out of water? David shook his head, but his expression remained serious. Phoenix won't run out of water, but the cost of water is going to increase significantly, and we're going to have to transition to more sustainable usage patterns. The city has been preparing for this scenario for years, investing in water recycling, technology, and groundwater management systems. He looked around the table, making eye contact with each family member as he explained concepts that were clearly the result of months of intensive research. The real opportunities are going to be in water conservation technology, desert agriculture techniques, and renewable energy systems that reduce the strain on water resources used for power generation. The companies and professionals who understand these systems are going to be in high demand as the Southwest adapts to permanent water scarcity. I watched Bob's face as David spoke, seeing the older man's expression shift from polite attention to genuine respect. This wasn't a teenager spouting opinions he'd picked up from environmental websites. This was someone who had clearly done serious research and understood the complex interconnections between environmental science, economic policy, and regional development. That's a pretty sophisticated analysis, Bob said finally. And there was something in his voice that I hadn't heard before when he spoke to David. It wasn't the patronizing tone he usually used with younger family members, but the respectful attention he gave to other adults whose expertise he valued. David smiled, and for the first time in months, it was his old easy grin rather than the determined expression he'd worn since the barbecue incident. "It's what I'm going to be studying at NAU," he said simply. "Water resource management, desert ecology, sustainable development systems. Arizona's going to need people who understand these issues, and the job market for environmental professionals is growing faster than almost any other field." The conversation continued for another hour, with David fielding questions from family members who were suddenly interested in his analysis of everything from solar energy economics to desert landscaping techniques. I realized that my son had accomplished something remarkable. He'd transformed himself from the quiet teenager who got dismissed at family gatherings into someone whose knowledge and insights were actively sought out by the same relatives who had previously ignored him. But more than that, David had demonstrated something that Bob's generation understood and respected: expertise earned through hard work and dedicated study. He hadn't demanded recognition or argued for his worth. He'd simply developed knowledge and skills that made him valuable, then demonstrated that value when the opportunity arose. As we drove home through the warm August night, I found myself thinking about the transformation I'd witnessed in my son over the past few months. The David who had been dismissed at Bob's barbecue was gone, replaced by someone who commanded respect through the quiet confidence that comes from genuine expertise. "I'm proud of you," I told him as we stopped at a traffic light near our neighborhood. "Not just for what you know, but for how you've chosen to use that knowledge." David was quiet for a moment, looking out at the desert landscape that had become his outdoor laboratory over the summer. "I realized something during that conversation tonight," he said finally. "Grandpa Bob wasn't really wrong about needing to understand practical career implications. He was just wrong about what those implications are for environmental science. Once I could show him the actual data about job growth and economic opportunities, he understood that my choice made sense." I smiled, recognizing the wisdom in David's approach. Instead of arguing with Bob's concerns about financial security and career prospects, David had addressed those concerns directly by demonstrating that environmental science offered exactly the kind of practical opportunities that Bob valued. "So, you're not angry about what happened at the barbecue anymore?" David shook his head. "I'm grateful for it, actually. It made me realize that I needed to stop assuming people would understand the value of what I was doing. If I want respect for my choices, I need to earn it by showing results, not just talking about passion and dreams. As we pulled into our driveway, I realized that my son had learned something that many adults never figure out: the difference between demanding recognition and earning it. David had chosen the harder path of developing genuine expertise and letting that expertise speak for itself, rather than trying to convince people through arguments or emotional appeals. What I didn't know yet was that David's summer of intensive research and professional development was just preparation for something much bigger. The internship, the academic research, the family conversations about water policy and environmental economics. All of it was leading toward a moment that would make Bob's original dismissal of David's career choice seem not just wrong, but embarrassingly uninformed. But that night, all I knew was that my son had found his voice and learned to use it with wisdom and strategic thinking that impressed even the most skeptical members of our family. The quiet teenager who had absorbed criticism without response was gone, replaced by someone who would never again be underestimated without consequences. Senior year arrived with the kind of desert heat that makes you question why anyone chose to build cities in Arizona. But David seemed energized by everything around him. While his classmates were focused on homecoming plans and college application essays, my son was operating on a completely different level. He'd wake up at 5 in the morning, not to cram for tests or finish last-minute homework, but to review research papers he'd downloaded the night before or to organize field notes from his weekend environmental surveys. I started finding printed articles scattered around the house, academic papers with titles like Economic Valuation of Ecosystem Services in Arid Landscapes and Career Trajectories in Environmental Consulting, a 20-year analysis. These weren't assignments for any class David was taking. They were self-directed research into aspects of environmental science that most college seniors never explored, let alone high school students. The transformation was most apparent during his interactions with teachers and school counselors. Mrs. Patterson, the guidance counselor who had initially tried to steer David toward more practical degree programs, now regularly consulted with him about environmental career paths for other students. She'd started referring to David as her environmental science expert, asking him to speak to underclassmen about opportunities in environmental fields. "Your son has become quite the resource," Mrs. Patterson told me during parent-teacher conferences in October. I had 3 different students come to me this week asking about environmental science programs because David had explained the career opportunities to them. He knows more about the field than most college advisors. David's environmental science teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had a similar story. She'd started incorporating David's independent research into her lesson plans, using his water quality data from the state internship to teach concepts about pollution monitoring and remediation strategies. "I've been teaching for 12 years, Mrs. Rodriguez confided after class one afternoon when I stopped by to pick up David. "I've never had a student who was already conducting professional-level research. David's work this summer would qualify for publication in peer-reviewed journals. That's graduate student-level achievement. But it wasn't just David's academic excellence that impressed his teachers. It was his ability to translate complex environmental concepts into practical applications that non-scientists could understand and appreciate. When Mrs. Rodriguez assigned a project on local environmental issues, most students wrote reports about pollution or recycling. David created a comprehensive presentation on economic opportunities in Arizona's renewable energy sector, complete with job growth projections, salary ranges, and specific companies that were hiring environmental professionals. The presentation caught the attention of Mr. Williams, the school's career counselor, who asked David to present his findings to the business advisory committee that helped connect students with local internship opportunities. Within a week of that presentation, David had received inquiries from 3 different environmental consulting firms asking if he'd be interested in part-time work during his senior year. "Companies don't usually recruit high school students," Mr. Williams explained to me over the phone. but David's research and presentation skills are impressive enough that several firms want to bring him on as a junior consultant. They're offering to pay him $15 an hour to assist with data collection and analysis. $15 an hour for part-time work while still in high school. That was more than many college graduates made in their first entry-level positions, and David was earning it based on expertise he'd developed through independent study and volunteer work. I found David in his room that evening, surrounded by business cards and contact information from environmental consulting firms that wanted to hire him. Instead of looking excited about the job offers, he seemed thoughtful, almost calculating. "You don't seem thrilled about having companies compete for your services," I observed, sitting on the edge of his bed next to a stack of research materials. That looked like preparation for graduate school rather than high school coursework. David looked up from the business card he'd been studying, one from an environmental consulting firm that specialized in water resource management for municipal governments. "It's not that I'm not excited," he said carefully. "It's that these offers are confirming something I've been researching for months. The demand for environmental professionals is much higher than most people realize, especially in Arizona where water scarcity and sustainable development are becoming critical issues." He reached for a folder that contained what looked like salary surveys and job market analyses for environmental science careers. David had been tracking employment data the way other teenagers followed sports statistics, compiling information that painted a picture of a field with robust growth and excellent earning potential. "Look at this," he said, showing me charts that tracked starting salaries for environmental scientists over the past 5 years. Entry-level positions in environmental consulting start at $48,000 annually, but professionals with specialized skills in water resource management or environmental impact assessment can earn $70,000 to $90,000 within 3 to 5 years. The numbers were impressive, but what struck me more was David's systematic approach to career research. He wasn't just following his passion for environmental science. He was building a comprehensive understanding of the economic opportunities within the field. "These consulting firms that want to hire me," David continued, "they're paying high school students $15 an hour because they can't find enough qualified applicants for environmental technician positions. There's a shortage of people with the technical skills and practical knowledge that environmental consulting requires." I stared at my son, realizing that he'd been conducting a level of career planning that most college juniors never attempted. While his classmates were worried about getting into good schools, David was already analyzing job market trends and positioning himself for specific opportunities within his chosen field. "So you're going to take one of these consulting jobs?" David shook his head, but he was smiling with that confident expression that meant he had a plan. "I'm going to turn them down," he said. "But not because the opportunities aren't good. I'm turning them down because I have something better lined up for next semester." Something better. I waited for David to explain, but he'd already moved on to organizing his research materials with the methodical precision that had become his trademark over the past few months. The mystery of David's something better became clear 2 weeks later, when he casually mentioned over dinner that he'd been accepted into Northern Arizona University's early admission research program for high school seniors. Not only had he been accepted, but he'd been awarded a research assistantship that would allow him to work directly with graduate students and faculty on environmental science projects while still completing his senior year of high school. "When did you apply for this?" Carlos asked, setting down his fork to give David his full attention. "Back in September," David replied, as if advanced research opportunities at state universities were normal extracurricular activities for high school students. "Dr. Martinez from my summer internship recommended me to Dr. Sarah Chen, who directs the Water Resources Research Lab at NAU. Dr. Chen reviewed my water quality analysis from this summer and invited me to join her research team." Carlos and I exchanged glances across the dinner table. Our 17-year-old son was being recruited by university research professors based on work he'd completed during a summer internship. This wasn't just academic achievement. This was professional recognition at a level that most college students never reached. "What kind of research will you be doing?" I asked, though part of me was afraid the answer would be so technical that I wouldn't understand it. David's eyes lit up with enthusiasm, the way they always did when he talked about environmental science applications. Dr. Chen's lab is developing new technologies for water reclamation in arid environments, he explained. They're working on biological treatment systems that use native desert plants to filter contaminants from wastewater, then recycle that water for agricultural and municipal use. He pulled out his phone and showed us photographs of experimental treatment facilities that looked like sophisticated greenhouse operations combined with high-tech laboratory equipment. The technology has potential applications throughout the Southwest, but especially in Arizona, where water scarcity is becoming a critical limitation on economic development. Dr. Chen thinks the research could lead to patent applications and commercial partnerships with water management companies. Patent applications, commercial partnerships. My high school son was describing research opportunities that sounded like the foundation for a successful career in environmental technology, not just preparation for college coursework. "This research assistantship," Carlos said slowly, "is this a paid position?" David nodded casually, as if earning money for academic research was a normal part of senior year. $1,200 per month plus academic credit that will transfer when I start full-time at NAU next fall. Dr. Chen said the experience will put me ahead of most environmental science majors who don't get involved in research until their junior or senior year of college. $1,200 per month. That was more than many adults made in part-time jobs, and David was earning it while still in high school by contributing to cutting-edge environmental research that could influence water policy throughout the southwestern United States. That night, after David had gone to his room to work on what he described as preliminary research proposals for his university lab position, Carlos and I sat in our kitchen trying to process what our son had accomplished. "When I was in high school," Carlos said, shaking his head in amazement, "my biggest achievement was making varsity soccer. David's getting paid to do university-level environmental research." I thought about Bob's comments at the barbecue 6 months earlier, his dismissive predictions about David wasting his intelligence on impractical environmental science studies. It seemed impossible that Bob could have been so wrong about the opportunities available in David's chosen field, but the evidence was overwhelming. Not only were environmental science careers financially viable, they were in such high demand that companies and universities were competing to hire high school students with the right skills and knowledge. "Should we tell the family about David's research position?" I asked Carlos, though part of me already knew the answer. Carlos was quiet for a moment, probably thinking about family dynamics and the best way to share news that would significantly change how everyone viewed David's academic and career choices. "Let's wait," he said finally. "David's been strategic about everything else. If there's a right time and place to share this news, he'll know when that is." Carlos was right. David had been methodically building his expertise and credentials, not to show off or prove points, but to create opportunities for himself in a field he genuinely cared about. The research assistantship wasn't just another academic achievement. It was evidence that David's approach to environmental science was opening doors that most people, including our family, hadn't known existed. Over the next few weeks, David's schedule became a careful balance of high school coursework, university research responsibilities, and what seemed like an increasing number of professional opportunities. Environmental consulting firms continued reaching out to him, impressed by recommendations from teachers and internship supervisors. Academic conferences invited him to present research findings that had emerged from his summer work with the State Environmental Quality Department. The most significant invitation came in November, when David received a request to present his water quality research at the Southwest Environmental Science Symposium, a regional conference that brought together environmental professionals, researchers, and policymakers from across Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada. "They want me to present my analysis of heavy metal contamination patterns in Phoenix groundwater," David explained, showing me the official invitation from the symposium organizing committee. It's a 20-minute presentation to an audience of environmental consultants, government regulators, and academic researchers. A 20-minute presentation at a professional conference. David would be sharing research findings with environmental science professionals who had decades of experience in the field. This was the kind of opportunity that graduate students competed for, not something typically offered to high school seniors. "Are you nervous about presenting to such an experienced audience?" I asked, though David seemed more excited than anxious about the opportunity. "Actually, I'm looking forward to it," he said with quiet confidence. "The research speaks for itself, and Dr. Martinez thinks the findings could influence how the state monitors groundwater contamination in urban areas. This is exactly the kind of practical application that environmental science is supposed to achieve." David's presentation at the Southwest Environmental Science Symposium was scheduled for the first Saturday in December, just 2 weeks before Desert Ridge High School's winter break. Carlos and I arranged to attend, not just to support David, but because we were curious to see how our son would perform in a professional environment surrounded by environmental science experts. The symposium was held at a downtown Phoenix hotel, in conference rooms filled with professionals who looked like they'd spent their careers working on environmental issues. Most of the attendees were middle-aged adults with advanced degrees and years of field experience. David, at 17, was by far the youngest presenter at the entire conference. I felt a surge of pride mixed with nervousness as David walked to the front of the conference room, carrying his laptop and a folder of research materials that he'd been refining for weeks. He was wearing the navy blue suit we'd bought for college interviews, and he looked professional and confident despite being surrounded by environmental scientists who had probably forgotten more about the field than most people ever learned. David's presentation was scheduled in the middle of the morning session, between talks by a senior researcher from Arizona State University and a policy analyst from the Environmental Protection Agency. As he set up his laptop and adjusted the microphone, I could see him taking deep breaths and organizing his thoughts the way he did before any important academic performance. "Good morning," David began, his voice clear and steady. "My name is David Martinez, and I'm here to present research on heavy metal contamination patterns in Phoenix area groundwater, conducted during my internship with the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality." For the next 20 minutes, David presented findings that he'd developed through months of water sample analysis and statistical evaluation. He explained contamination sources, discussed remediation strategies, and answered questions from conference attendees with the kind of expertise that comes from hands-on research experience rather than just academic study. The questions from the audience were sophisticated and challenging, the kind that experienced environmental professionals ask when they want to test someone's depth of knowledge. David answered each question thoughtfully and thoroughly, referencing additional research and acknowledging limitations in his data while suggesting directions for future study. "This analysis represents exactly the kind of practical environmental science that our state needs," commented Dr. Rebecca Hayes, a senior researcher from University of Arizona who served as the session moderator. "The methodology is sound, the conclusions are well supported, and the policy implications are significant." After David's presentation, he was surrounded by environmental professionals who wanted to discuss his research in more detail. Business. Cards were exchanged, research collaborations were suggested, and job opportunities were mentioned with the kind of casualness that suggested David had established himself as someone worth recruiting. Carlos and I watched from the back of the conference room as our 17-year-old son networked with environmental science professionals like he belonged in their world. Because, we realized, he did belong. David had earned his place in that room through the quality of his research and the depth of his knowledge, not through family connections or academic credentials. "Your son is impressive," said Dr. Hayes, approaching us after the session ended. "I've been working in environmental science for 23 years, and I rarely see research of this caliber from undergraduate students, let alone high school seniors." She handed me her business card, explaining that University of Arizona's Environmental Science program would be interested in recruiting David for their graduate program once he completed his undergraduate degree. Graduate program? I asked, still processing the implications of what Dr. Hayes was suggesting. Students with David's research experience and technical skills typically accelerate through undergraduate coursework, Dr. Hayes explained. If he continues developing expertise at this rate, he'll be ready for graduate-level research by his junior year of college. Graduate school by junior year. Career opportunities that were already materializing while David was still in high school. Professional recognition from environmental science experts who evaluated his work based on merit rather than age or academic status. As we drove home from the symposium, David was unusually quiet, not from exhaustion or stress, but from what looked like deep satisfaction with how the presentation had gone. "How do you feel about today?" I asked as we merged onto the freeway that would take us back to Mesa. David was quiet for a moment, looking out at the desert landscape that had become both his laboratory and his professional inspiration. "I feel like I proved something to myself," he said finally. "Not that I needed to prove anything to anyone else, but that I could hold my own in a room full of environmental science professionals. That the work I've been doing is genuinely valuable, not just impressive for a high school student." That distinction was important, I realized. David hadn't been seeking recognition or validation from environmental professionals. He'd been testing his own abilities and knowledge against professional standards, confirming that his passion for environmental science was matched by genuine expertise that others in the field respected and valued. "What's next?" Carlos asked from the driver's seat. "More research opportunities? More conference presentations?" David smiled, and for the first time in months, it was his old relaxed grin rather than the determined expression he'd worn since Bob's barbecue comments. "Graduation," he said simply. "And then college, where I'll have 4 years to build on what I've learned." But even as David talked about graduation and college plans, I could see that he was still working on something, still preparing for a moment that would bring his high school achievements to a satisfying conclusion. The research assistantship, the conference presentation, the professional recognition, all of it seemed to be leading toward something that David hadn't shared with us yet. What I didn't know was that my son had been saving the best news for last, that all of his research and professional development had been building toward an opportunity that would make Bob's dismissive comments about government salaries and limited career prospects seem not just wrong, but spectacularly misinformed. That night, as I watched David organize research materials and correspondence from environmental professionals who wanted to stay in touch with him, I realized that my son had accomplished something remarkable. He'd transformed himself from a dismissed teenager into someone whose expertise was actively sought by environmental science professionals, someone whose research contributed to policy discussions that would affect millions of people. But more than that, David had proven that following your passion doesn't require sacrificing practical considerations like financial security and career advancement. He'd shown that environmental science offered exactly the kind of opportunities that families like ours valued: intellectual challenge, professional recognition, and economic stability. The quiet teenager who had absorbed Bob's criticism without response was gone, replaced by someone who would never again be underestimated by anyone who understood what real achievement looked like. And graduation day was still 4 months away. The spring semester of David's senior year brought an energy that felt different from anything we'd experienced before. While his classmates were dealing with senioritis and the anxiety of college acceptance letters, David moved with the focused determination of someone who knew exactly where he was heading and why. His mornings began earlier than ever, not with cramming for tests, but with correspondence from environmental research labs, consulting firms, and academic institutions that had discovered his work through professional networks. The transformation in how others perceived David became impossible to ignore during the spring college fair at Desert Ridge High School. Representatives from universities across the Southwest had set up booths in the gymnasium, hoping to attract the attention of academically talented seniors who might still be considering their options. What struck me wasn't just that David drew interested questions from admissions counselors, but that several representatives specifically sought him out after hearing about his research background from other educators. "Are you the student who presented at the Southwest Environmental Science Symposium?" asked Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the recruitment coordinator for Arizona State University's Environmental Science program. She'd approached David at the Northern Arizona University booth, where he'd been discussing advanced coursework options with the admissions representative. David nodded, seeming unsurprised that his conference presentation had reached ASU's attention. "Yes, ma'am. I presented research on groundwater contamination patterns in urban areas." Dr. Walsh's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine recruitment mode. "We've been following your work through professional networks. Your research methodology impressed several of our faculty members. Have you considered transferring to ASU after your first year at Northern Arizona? Our environmental engineering program offers research opportunities that might align well with your interests. Transfer to ASU." The same university that Bob had suggested would be more appropriate for someone with David's intelligence. The same institution that the family had implied was more prestigious than David's choice of Northern Arizona University. Now ASU was actively recruiting David based on achievements he'd accomplished while planning to attend the school they'd previously dismissed as inadequate. "I appreciate the interest," David replied diplomatically. "But I'm committed to NAU's program. Their Water Resources Research Lab is exactly what I'm looking for, and I've already established working relationships with faculty there." Dr. Walsh persisted, explaining ASU's research funding, graduate school placement rates, and industry connections. She handed David several brochures and her direct contact information, encouraging him to reconsider his college choice based on what she described as exceptional career preparation opportunities. Similar conversations happened throughout the college fair. Representatives from University of Arizona, Colorado State University, and even schools as far away as UC Davis expressed interest in David's academic background and research experience. What had begun as a routine college fair became an impromptu recruitment event focused on my son. "This is unprecedented," Mrs. Patterson told me as we watched David field questions from multiple university representatives. "I've been organizing college fairs for 8 years, and I've never seen recruitment like this for a student who's already committed to a school." The attention from universities was flattering, but what impressed me more was David's response to the recruitment pressure. He listened respectfully to each presentation, asked thoughtful questions about research opportunities and program requirements, but remained firmly committed to his original choice. David had selected Northern Arizona University based on careful analysis of their environmental science program, not on status or family expectations, and no amount of external pressure could shake that decision. The most significant recruitment conversation happened in early March, when Dr. Elena Rodriguez from New Mexico State University approached David after learning about his water reclamation research through academic networks. "Your work on biological treatment systems caught our attention," Dr. Rodriguez explained, referring to David's ongoing research assistantship with NAU faculty. "We're developing a new graduate program in arid land water management, and we're looking for exceptional undergraduate researchers who might be interested in accelerated degree pathways." Accelerated degree pathways, graduate program opportunities. Being discussed with a high school senior who hadn't even started college yet, David listened with genuine interest as Dr. Rodriguez described research funding, thesis opportunities, and career placement services that typically attracted students in their junior or senior years of undergraduate study. The program is designed for students who want to address water scarcity issues throughout the American Southwest, Dr. Rodriguez continued. Based on your research background, you'd be competitive for graduate research assistantships that provide full tuition coverage plus living stipends of $24,000 annually. $24,000 annually, plus full tuition coverage for graduate research in environmental science. These weren't theoretical opportunities being discussed for some distant future. They were concrete offers being extended to David based on work he'd already accomplished as a teenager. "That's very generous," David replied. "But I'm planning to complete my undergraduate degree before considering graduate programs." Dr. Rodriguez smiled, clearly accustomed to ambitious students who wanted to take traditional academic pathways. "Of course, but keep us in mind when you're ready for graduate school. Students with your research experience and technical skills don't need 4 full years of undergraduate coursework to be ready for advanced study." After the college fair, as David and I drove home through the desert evening, I found myself thinking about the trajectory of his senior year. In September, he'd been a bright teenager with good grades and environmental interests. By March, he was being recruited by graduate programs and offered research funding that most college seniors would envy. "How does it feel to have universities competing for your attention?" I asked as we waited at a traffic light near our neighborhood. David was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts in that careful way that had become characteristic of his approach to important conversations. "It feels validating," he said finally. "Not because I need external validation, but because it confirms that the path I've chosen has real opportunities. When Grandpa Bob questioned whether environmental science was practical, I couldn't point to concrete evidence that he was wrong. Now I can." That phrase, "now I can," suggested that David had been building toward something specific, accumulating evidence and achievements that would make a particular point at a particular moment. I suspected that moment was approaching, probably around graduation, but David's strategic thinking had become sophisticated enough that I'd learned to wait for his plans to reveal themselves naturally. The spring months passed with increasing momentum as David balanced high school coursework, university research responsibilities, and what seemed like a growing list of professional opportunities. Environmental consulting firms continued reaching out about internship programs. Academic conferences requested presentations of his research findings. Professional organizations invited him to join student chapters and attend networking events. Most significantly, the research David had been conducting through his NAU assistantship was producing results that impressed even experienced environmental scientists. Dr. Sarah Chen, who supervised David's work in the Water Resources Lab, called me in April to discuss what she described as exceptional contributions to ongoing research projects. David's analysis of desert plant filtration systems has identified biological processes that we hadn't previously understood, Dr. Chen explained during our phone conversation. His work is going to be featured in a paper that we're submitting to the Journal of Environmental Engineering, with David listed as co-author. Co-author on a peer-reviewed academic publication. This was the kind of achievement that graduate students worked years to accomplish, and David was earning it during his senior year of high school through the quality and originality of his research contributions. The paper focuses on cost-effective water reclamation technologies for arid environments, Dr. Chen continued. David's research demonstrates that native desert plants can achieve filtration efficiency comparable to expensive engineered systems, but at significantly lower operational costs. Lower operational costs. Environmental solutions that were both effective and economically viable. David had been developing expertise in exactly the kind of practical environmental science that addressed Bob's concerns about career prospects and financial stability. "There's something else," Dr. Chen added, and I could hear excitement in her voice. "David's research has attracted attention from the National Science Foundation. They're considering funding a larger study based on his preliminary findings." National Science Foundation funding. Federal research grants being awarded based on work that my son had completed before graduating from high school. This was recognition, at a level that most environmental science professors never achieved, let alone undergraduate students. As graduation approached, David's achievements seemed to accelerate rather than plateau. In May, he was invited to present his water reclamation research at the National Environmental Science Conference in Denver, where his presentation would be attended by researchers from universities across the country. The invitation came with travel funding and an honorarium that treated David as a professional scientist rather than a student presenter. 2 weeks before graduation, David received notification that his co-authored paper had been accepted for publication in the Journal of Environmental Engineering, one of the most respected publications in the field. The acceptance letter praised the research as innovative and practically significant, noting that the findings could influence water management policies throughout the southwestern United States. But the most significant news came just 5 days before Desert Ridge High School's graduation ceremony, when David casually mentioned over dinner that he'd received an email from someone at the National Science Foundation. "They want to discuss a research fellowship," David said, cutting into the carne asada that Carlos had grilled for our weekly family dinner. "It's called the Graduate Research Fellowship Program, and it provides 3 years of graduate school, funding plus research stipends." Graduate Research Fellowship Program. I'd heard of this program through my work as an educator. It was one of the most prestigious graduate funding opportunities available to science students, with acceptance rates typically below 15%. Most recipients were doctoral candidates who had already completed undergraduate degrees and demonstrated exceptional research potential. "When did you apply for this fellowship?" Carlos asked, setting down his fork to give David his complete attention. "I didn't apply," David replied, seeming almost surprised by the question. "Dr. Chen nominated me based on the water reclamation research. The NSF selection committee reviewed my publications and research portfolio, then invited me to interview for the fellowship. Nominated for a graduate research fellowship while still in high school. Invited to interview based on a research portfolio that most graduate students would struggle to compile." David was describing opportunities that existed at the intersection of exceptional talent and strategic preparation, achievements that placed him in conversation with the most promising environmental science researchers in the country. "What does the fellowship include?" I asked, though part of me was afraid the answer would be so impressive that I'd have trouble processing it. David pulled out his phone and scrolled through what looked like official correspondence from the National Science Foundation. Full tuition coverage for graduate school, plus annual living stipends of $34,000 for 3 years, he read from the fellowship description. Recipients also receive research funding, conference travel support, and priority access to national laboratory facilities. $34,000 annually, plus full tuition, plus research funding. David was describing a graduate fellowship package worth more than $100,000 over 3 years, offered to him before he'd even started college. "The interview is scheduled for next Tuesday," David continued, 3 days before graduation. "They're conducting interviews via video conference because of the timing. Video conference interview with the National Science Foundation 3 days before high school graduation." David's senior year was ending with opportunities that most environmental science doctoral candidates only dreamed about. Recognition that validated every choice he'd made since Bob's dismissive comments at the barbecue 11 months earlier. That night, after David had gone to his room to prepare for what he described as preliminary research presentations for his fellowship interview, Carlos and I sat in our kitchen trying to understand what our son had accomplished. "When I was his age," Carlos said, shaking his head in amazement, "my biggest worry was passing calculus. David's interviewing for graduate research fellowships with the federal government. I thought about the trajectory of David's senior year, from the quiet teenager who'd absorbed Bob's criticism without response to someone whose research was being considered for federal funding. The transformation hadn't happened through luck or connections, but through systematic dedication to developing expertise that commanded respect from environmental science professionals. Should we tell the family about the fellowship interview?" I asked Carlos, though I suspected David had his own plans for sharing this news. Carlos was quiet for a moment, probably thinking about family dynamics and the most appropriate way to discuss achievements that would fundamentally change how everyone viewed David's academic and career choices. "Let's wait," he said finally. David's been strategic about everything else. If he wants the family to know about this opportunity, he'll find the right moment to share it. The fellowship interview took place the Tuesday before graduation, in David's bedroom with his laptop positioned to show his research materials and academic awards in the background. Carlos and I tried to give him privacy, but we couldn't help, overhearing fragments of conversation that sounded more like professional collaboration than student evaluation. "Your research methodology demonstrates sophisticated understanding of biological filtration systems," we heard one interviewer comment. "The cost-benefit analysis you've developed could influence federal water management policies. The practical applications of your work extend beyond academic research," said another voice. "We're particularly interested in your ability to translate complex environmental science into policy recommendations that non-scientists can understand and implement." The interview lasted 90 minutes, covering David's research background, career objectives, and ideas for future environmental science projects. From what we could hear, the conversation was collaborative and enthusiastic, with interviewers asking detailed questions about research methods and policy implications rather than basic academic qualifications. When David emerged from his room after the interview, he looked satisfied but not nervous, like someone who had presented his best work and was comfortable with whatever decision resulted. "How did it go?" I asked, though David's calm confidence suggested the interview had gone well. "Good, I think," David replied. "They asked about my research experience and long-term career goals. The conversation felt more like planning future projects than evaluating whether I was qualified for the fellowship." Planning future projects. David's fellowship interview had been conducted at the level of professional consultation rather than student assessment, suggesting that the National Science Foundation saw him as someone whose research would contribute significantly to environmental science advancement. "When will you hear about their decision?" Carlos asked. David checked his phone, scrolling through what looked like follow-up emails from the interview committee. "They said I'd receive notification within 48 hours, he replied. "The fellowship decisions need to be finalized before graduation, so recipients can plan their graduate school enrollment. 48 hours. By Thursday evening, we'd know whether David had been awarded one of the most prestigious graduate research fellowships available to science students, recognition that would provide full funding for graduate school plus research stipends that exceeded many professional salaries." Wednesday passed slowly, with David maintaining his usual routine of high school classes, research work, and preparation for graduation ceremonies. If he was anxious about the fellowship decision, he didn't show it, continuing to approach his responsibilities with the methodical focus that had characterized his entire senior year. Thursday afternoon brought unseasonably cool weather for late May in Arizona, the kind of desert spring day that made you remember why people chose to live in a landscape that spent most of the year trying to kill them. David was in his room, working on what he described as final preparations for graduation, when his phone rang with a call from an unknown number with a Washington, D.C. area code. I was folding laundry in the hallway when I heard David answer the phone with unusually formal politeness. "Hello, this is David Martinez," he said. And then there was a long silence punctuated by occasional responses of, "Yes, sir," and "Thank you very much." The conversation lasted about 10 minutes, ending with David saying, "I'm honored to accept the fellowship. Thank you for this opportunity." I knocked on his door immediately after hearing him end the call, unable to contain my curiosity about what had clearly been significant news. "That was Dr. Michael Thompson from the National Science Foundation," David said, setting his phone on his desk next to graduation cap and gown that were hanging ready for tomorrow's ceremony. "I've been awarded the Graduate Research Fellowship. Graduate Research Fellowship. 3 years of full funding for graduate school, plus research stipends, plus priority access to national laboratory facilities. David had been selected for one of the most competitive graduate fellowships in environmental science, recognition that would support his research through doctoral study and position him for leadership roles in environmental policy and research. "David, that's incredible," I managed to say, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he'd accomplished. "Dr. Thompson said the selection committee was impressed by my research portfolio and practical applications," David continued, showing me official correspondence that confirmed fellowship details. "They think my work on water reclamation technologies addresses critical infrastructure needs throughout the American Southwest." Critical infrastructure needs. Federal research funding based on work that addressed regional environmental challenges. David's research wasn't just academically impressive. It was practically significant enough to warrant national investment in his continued education and professional development. "When do you start the fellowship?" I asked, still processing the implications of what David had achieved. "After I complete my undergraduate degree at NAU," David replied. "But Dr. Thompson said the fellowship committee expects I'll be ready for graduate school earlier than traditional timelines. Students with research experience like mine typically accelerate through undergraduate coursework, accelerated undergraduate programs leading to early graduate school enrollment." David's fellowship wasn't just recognition for past achievements, it was investment in future contributions that the National Science Foundation expected him to make to environmental science research and policy development. That evening, as our family prepared for David's graduation ceremony, I found myself thinking about the transformation I'd witnessed over the past 11 months. The teenager who had been dismissed at Bob's barbecue had become someone whose research was funded by the federal government, whose expertise was sought by universities across the country, whose work would influence environmental policy decisions, affecting millions of people. But more than the external recognition, I was impressed by David's strategic approach to proving his worth. Instead of arguing with Bob's dismissive comments, David had systematically developed expertise and achievements that made those comments seem not just wrong, but embarrassingly uninformed. He'd chosen to respond to underestimation with evidence, rather than emotion, building a case for his choices that was impossible to dismiss or ignore. "How do you want to share this news with the family?" Carlos asked as we prepared to leave for the graduation ceremony. "This is the kind of achievement that changes how everyone views your academic choices." David was adjusting his graduation cap in the hallway mirror, looking calm and confident despite having just received news that would alter the trajectory of his entire career. "I think graduation day is the perfect time to share everything," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he'd been planning this moment for months. "When they announced scholarship recipients during the ceremony, people will understand what environmental science opportunities actually look like." Scholarship recipients. David had mentioned this detail casually, as if it was just another aspect of graduation day rather than additional recognition that we hadn't heard about yet. "What scholarship recipients?" I asked, suddenly realizing that David might have even more news that he hadn't shared. David smiled, the first completely relaxed smile I'd seen from him since Bob's barbecue comments had started his methodical campaign to prove his worth. "The National Merit Environmental Science Scholarship," he said simply. "Full tuition coverage for undergraduate study, plus research stipends, plus guaranteed admission to graduate programs. They're announcing it tomorrow during graduation. Full tuition coverage, research stipends, guaranteed graduate school admission." David had been awarded not just the National Science Foundation Fellowship for graduate study, but also undergraduate scholarship support that would make his environmental science education completely funded from high school through doctoral completion. "When did you receive this scholarship?" Carlos asked, clearly amazed that David had been accumulating major academic achievements without sharing them immediately. 2 weeks ago, David replied. But they asked recipients not to discuss the awards until the official announcement during graduation ceremonies. Tomorrow, When they call my name and explain the scholarship details, everyone will understand exactly what opportunities exist in environmental science. Everyone will understand. David had been strategically saving his most impressive achievements for graduation day, when the entire family would be present to witness recognition that would make Bob's dismissive comments about government salaries and limited career prospects seem not just mistaken, but spectacularly uninformed. As we drove toward Desert Ridge High School for graduation ceremonies, I realized that my son had orchestrated one of the most satisfying responses to underestimation that I'd ever witnessed. Instead of demanding immediate recognition or arguing for respect, David had quietly built achievements that would speak for themselves at exactly the right moment. Tomorrow, when David walked across the graduation stage and the principal announced his National Merit Environmental Science Scholarship, everyone would understand that environmental science offered exactly the kind of opportunities that families, like ours, valued: intellectual challenge, professional recognition, and financial security that exceeded most traditional career paths. The quiet teenager who had absorbed Bob's criticism without response was about to demonstrate that the best revenge isn't argument or confrontation, but success so undeniable that former critics have no choice but to acknowledge they were wrong. Graduation day arrived with the kind of perfect Arizona morning that made you forget about the brutal summers and appreciate the desert's capacity for beauty. The ceremony was scheduled for 9 a.m. to avoid the heat that would make sitting in an outdoor amphitheater unbearable by noon, and families began gathering early to secure good seats for what would be a celebration of achievements that had been building for months. I spotted Bob and Rosa in the third row, along with Linda, Mike, and Jessica, who had driven down from Phoenix to attend David's graduation. The family had come together to celebrate an achievement that they probably still viewed as the end of David's academic career, rather than the beginning of professional recognition that would reshape their understanding of environmental science opportunities. David looked confident and composed in his cap and gown, standing with his classmates as they prepared to process into the amphitheater. At 17, he was younger than most of his graduating class, but the achievements he'd accumulated over his senior year had given him a maturity and professional bearing that made him seem ready for whatever challenges awaited him in college and beyond. The graduation ceremony proceeded with the usual speeches about bright futures and limitless possibilities, but I found myself anticipating the moment when scholarship recipients would be recognized. David had mentioned that the National Merit Environmental Science Scholarship would be announced during the ceremony, but he hadn't provided details about how the recognition would be presented or what information would be shared with the audience. Principal Martinez took the podium as the ceremony moved toward individual recognition of outstanding graduates. "Before we begin calling names for diploma presentation," she announced, "we want to recognize several students who have received prestigious academic scholarships based on exceptional achievement in their chosen fields of study." Prestigious academic scholarships. I could see David in the third row of graduates, sitting calmly with his hands folded, looking like someone who was comfortable with whatever recognition was about to come. "Our first scholarship recipient has demonstrated exceptional achievement in environmental science research," Principal Martinez continued, reading from prepared remarks. "This student has been awarded the National Merit Environmental Science Scholarship, which provides full tuition coverage for undergraduate study, annual research stipends of $15,000, and guaranteed admission to graduate programs. In environmental science, full tuition coverage plus research stipends plus guaranteed graduate admission." The scholarship details were even more impressive when announced publicly, representing total educational funding that exceeded what most families could afford to provide for their children's college education. "This scholarship is awarded annually to fewer than 50 students nationwide," Principal Martinez continued, "based on original research, academic excellence, and demonstrated potential for leadership in environmental science fields." Fewer than 50 students nationwide. David had been selected from thousands of applicants for recognition that placed him among the most promising environmental science students in the country. Please join me in congratulating David Martinez for receiving the National Merit Environmental Science Scholarship. The applause that followed was enthusiastic but not overwhelming, the kind of recognition that outstanding students typically receive at graduation ceremonies. But I was watching Bob's face, and I could see his expression shifting from polite attention to genuine surprise as he processed what the scholarship announcement meant. Principal Martinez wasn't finished with David's recognition. Additionally, David has been awarded the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, providing full graduate school funding, plus research stipends for doctoral study in environmental science. This fellowship is awarded to fewer than 2,000 students annually across all science fields, making David one of the youngest recipients in the program's history. National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. The second major award announcement made clear that David's achievements weren't just impressive for a high school student, but competitive at the national level among graduate researchers in environmental science. The applause this time was more sustained, with audience members clearly recognizing that they were witnessing recognition at a level that transcended typical high school achievements. I could see family members in our row turning to look at each other with expressions that ranged from amazement to confusion about how David had accomplished so much without their awareness. But Principal Martinez still wasn't finished. David's research on water reclamation technologies has been published in peer-reviewed academic journals and has attracted funding consideration from federal agencies. His work demonstrates the kind of practical environmental science that addresses critical infrastructure needs throughout the American Southwest. Published research, federal funding consideration. David's achievements were being described in terms that made clear his work had professional significance beyond academic recognition. David will be continuing his environmental science studies at Northern Arizona University, where he has been invited to join advanced research programs typically reserved for graduate students. His scholarship and fellowship awards provide complete educational funding through doctoral completion, representing total support exceeding $400,000 over 6 years of study. $400,000 in educational funding, complete support through doctoral completion. David's environmental science education was being funded at a level that would make financial concerns about his career choice completely irrelevant. The sustained applause that followed this final announcement was accompanied by what sounded like surprised conversations throughout the audience as people processed the magnitude of David's achievements. $400,000 in scholarship and fellowship funding represented more educational support than most professionals earned in several years of work. I turned to look at Bob, whose expression had shifted from surprise to what looked like genuine shock as he understood the implications of what he'd just heard. The grandson he'd dismissed for choosing environmental science over more practical career paths had been recognized at the national level for achievements that most adults never approached in their professional careers. When David's name was called for diploma presentation, he walked across the stage with quiet confidence, shaking hands with Principal Martinez and accepting his diploma with the composure of someone who had earned recognition through systematic dedication rather than luck or connections. As David returned to his seat, I could see him making eye contact with family members in the audience, offering a small smile that suggested satisfaction rather than vindication. He'd accomplished what he'd set out to prove 11 months earlier when Bob questioned whether environmental science was worth pursuing. But his expression suggested that the proof had been for his own benefit rather than anyone else's validation. After the ceremony, as families gathered in the parking lot for photographs and congratulations, the dynamics felt different from typical graduation celebrations. Instead of polite encouragement about college plans and career prospects, David was receiving questions about research opportunities and professional recognition that adults typically associated with established careers rather than educational preparation. Bob approached David first, and I could see the older man choosing his words carefully as he processed what he'd learned during the scholarship announcements. "That's quite an achievement," Bob said, extending his hand to David with more respect than I'd seen him show any of the younger family members. $400,000 in educational funding is more than most people make in several years. David shook his grandfather's hand, accepting the recognition without any trace of smugness or satisfaction about proving Bob's earlier dismissal wrong. Environmental science has more opportunities than most people realize, David replied diplomatically. The scholarship and fellowship awards are investments in research that addresses practical problems like water scarcity and sustainable development. Bob nodded slowly, clearly reassessing his understanding of environmental science career prospects based on the evidence he'd just witnessed. I may have misjudged the field, Bob admitted. And those words represented the closest thing to an apology that anyone in our family had ever heard from him. Your achievements suggest that environmental science offers exactly the kind of opportunities that I thought were missing. Linda and Mike joined the conversation, asking questions about David's research and graduate school plans with genuine interest, rather than the polite dismissal they'd shown toward his academic choices in previous family gatherings. Jessica, the business major who had been held up as the example of practical career planning, seemed genuinely impressed by David's achievements and asked detailed questions about environmental science opportunities. I had no idea that environmental science offered this kind of recognition, Jessica said, reviewing the scholarship details that David patiently explained. $400,000 in funding plus guaranteed graduate admission sounds like better career preparation than most business programs provide. Better career preparation than business programs. David's achievements had shifted family perceptions to the point where environmental science was being compared favorably to the career paths that had previously been held up as superior alternatives. As the family celebration continued into the afternoon, I found myself watching David interact with relatives who were now treating him as someone whose academic and career choices deserved respect, rather than polite tolerance. The transformation wasn't just in David's achievements, but in how those achievements had changed family dynamics and expectations. Rosa approached me as I was watching David explain his water reclamation research to Uncle Mike, who was asking detailed questions about commercial applications and business opportunities in environmental technology. That boy has surprised all of us, Rosa said in Spanish, smiling as she watched her grandson command respect from adults who had previously dismissed his interests. He was patient with people who didn't understand his worth, but he never stopped, working to prove himself. Patient with people who didn't understand his worth. Rosa's observation captured exactly what David had accomplished over the past 11 months. Instead of demanding immediate recognition or arguing for respect, he'd systematically built achievements that made recognition inevitable and undeniable. He's shown all of us what real success looks like, I replied, watching David field questions about research opportunities and graduate school plans with the expertise of someone who had earned the right to discuss professional prospects with confidence. That evening, after the extended family had returned to their homes and David had changed out of his graduation attire, we sat in our backyard, enjoying the desert sunset and reflecting on a day that had exceeded every expectation I'd held for my son's high school graduation. How does it feel to have proven everyone wrong? Carlos asked, though David's calm satisfaction suggested that proving others wrong hadn't been his primary motivation. David was quiet for a moment, looking out at the saguaro cacti and desert landscape that had served as his outdoor laboratory throughout high school. It feels good to have proven myself right, he said finally. When Grandpa Bob questioned my choices, I realized I needed to understand exactly what opportunities existed in environmental science. The research, the scholarships, the professional recognition. All of that came from following my interest with strategic planning. Strategic planning. David had transformed personal passion into professional opportunity through systematic dedication to developing expertise that commanded respect from environmental science professionals and federal funding agencies. What's next? I asked, though I suspected David had been planning beyond graduation for months. David smiled, and for the first time in nearly a year, it was completely relaxed rather than determined. College, graduate school, and eventually research that makes a difference in how we manage natural resources, he said. But first, I want to enjoy the fact that I never have to prove my choices are valid again. The evidence speaks for itself. Now. The evidence speaks for itself. David had accomplished something that most people never manage. He'd transformed criticism into motivation, used underestimation as fuel for achievement, and built success so undeniable that former skeptics had no choice but to acknowledge their mistakes. As I watched my son organize research materials and correspondence from universities that wanted to recruit him for advanced programs, I realized that David's story wasn't just about proving family members wrong or earning academic recognition. It was about the power of responding to dismissal with excellence, about choosing strategic achievement over emotional argument, about building worth that exists independent of others' opinions. The quiet teenager who had absorbed Bob's criticism without response had become someone whose expertise was valued by federal research agencies, whose work influenced environmental policy discussions, whose achievements represented the kind of success that families like ours had always valued but hadn't recognized in environmental science. Tomorrow, David would begin preparing for college with complete financial support and guaranteed opportunities for advanced study. But tonight, he could rest in the satisfaction of having proven that following your passion doesn't require sacrificing practical considerations, that environmental science offers exactly the kind of career prospects that justify parental pride and family recognition. The boy who had been told he was wasting his intelligence had demonstrated intelligence so effectively applied that it earned him recognition at the highest levels of academic and professional achievement. And the family who had questioned his choices now understood that they had been spectacularly wrong about the opportunities available to someone with David's dedication and expertise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.